Thank you. I can be heard. The mic's working. Cool. Right. Well, that's the title, getting it out there, Python, JavaScript, and web visualizations. The main thrust is going to be that I'm not saying if it's not on the web, it's not valuable, certainly from a visualization perspective, but having been caught with beautiful visualizations that all require installing Python or some library or somewhere, and then feeling that I should get them onto the web and never really finding the time, and the threshold to entry being what it is, stuff just is out there, dead, essentially. No one will ever see it. And if you start from the premise that you're going to stick it on the web, then you can just press a button one day and everyone in the world will see what you're up to, which to me is a huge, huge advantage. So this is sort of about building up to that. Talk structure. Going to give a very brief and very partial introduction to JavaScript from a Pythonist perspective, mine. Then talk about JSON, which is, I'm sure all of you know, a data format, and it's also pretty much the glue between JavaScript and Python. I'm going to talk about how to serve that JSON, inevitably JSON data, the various ways you can do that. A couple of use cases, and then summing up. So first off, get it out of the way. This is how the web should be. You see something cool you like, you maybe want to emulate. You click on the view page source, and you see, beautiful. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen ever. It's certainly not going to happen for a very long time. If it does happen, it will be missing important libraries. So the important thing is just to face facts. You're not going to be coding in Python on the browser anytime soon in a way that is remotely like your experience of coding in Python on the server. So it's lovely, lovely idea, and I wish it would happen, but it's not. It's going to be like nuclear fusion. It's always just going to be a generation or so away. So, right, back in the real world, JavaScript is the only game in town. That's it, if you're on the browser. There's lots and lots of things you'll probably hear about, but they all basically come down to JavaScript. Everything else is incredibly techy and not a good place for any novice to be starting, and I'm kind of pitching this novice-wise. I'm assuming kind of a Python background who wants to sort of spread into browser programming. So then the challenge is to make JavaScript play nicely with your favorite backend toolset, which of course in this case is Python, and to leverage Python's far superior data crafting skills complement. The good news is there's nothing in JavaScript that compares with the powerful Python libraries, nothing at all, and there probably won't be for a very long time. So they need each other, basically. But the good news is JavaScript is getting better and better, much more powerful than it ever used to be, and there are some libraries there which, quite frankly, are as good as anything in the Python world. Thinking really primarily of, say, D3, but there's some other stuff as well. D3 will crop up. It's called data-driven documents, and it's a huge 400-pound gorilla of a library, which I'm not going to teach you about today, just mention. So now, a few personal observations. The picture sums it up, really. Right, oops. JavaScript, programming in JavaScript is, for anyone who's sort of come from a background where you would assume, fairly easy importation, say, of modules. They're working on that. Server-side JavaScript has something that sort of works, but inevitably it doesn't work on the browser, so you end up with this weird shim that sort of holds together, but there's a religious war there about what form that shim should take. So basically it's confused. Things like global by default are just obviously evil. If you declare a variable in JavaScript and you're not careful, then essentially it's available to the global namespace. In fact, the whole idea of namespaces is not enforced. You have to force yourself. ECMAScript was written in about 2 weeks, I think it was, back in 1996 or something. It doesn't feel like a language that was really thought about deeply. Having said, it's not nearly as bad as people might tell you, but it really does have rough edges. Here's one, the ugly. Basically, you can't default parameters. How do you get them? Well, you end up doing this sort of thing a lot. Even looping is much more involved than it should be. There is a book by a guy called Douglas Crockford who created JSON called JavaScript, The Good Parts. I'd recommend everybody to read that. It's quite short. And his main, yes, his main idea is that essentially if you enforce a few kind of rough principles, then you can certainly save yourself a lot of pain in the future. Another thing to mention at this point, really important, if you are programming JavaScript, get yourself a linter. JS lint is sort of the standard. That was written by Crockford. There's another one called JS hint, which is more human. Crockford is a very opinionated man, and not everyone agrees with his opinion about JavaScript syntax. But nevertheless, if you've got Emacs or Vim or anything, there'll be a linter that will basically be parsing your code while you write, and everything that's wrong will just appear in big red blocks, and that's really, really helpful. It will save you a huge amount of trouble in the future, and there will be trouble, I'm afraid. Right, so many stands to choose from. There is a culture to JavaScript which I think is different to the culture of Python. Python, having been in Python a long time, which means maybe the gloss has worn off, but not the gloss, it's a sort of different word, but it feels younger, less mature, more kind of, I was a script kiddie and now I'm programming on your server, what could go wrong, sort of thing. There are elements of that, and one of the things, the enthusiasm, this youthful enthusiasm, means that a lot of people just like to write libraries. They're not really interested in using existing ones or improving them. They just want to write their own, and they do. I thought actually while I was watching Neil's talk, it suddenly occurred to me that so the difference between a JavaScript frameworks and a bus is that with JavaScript frameworks, there's always 3 coming along at once, and I just pat myself on the back for that. But basically, you got all these ones, they come on. I use one that's just down here called Angular. I'm not religious about it. There's all sorts of ups and downs. It's stable. I like it. It enforces best practice. It has a lot of very good things going for it. I'm not going to get into them now, but I will happily tell anybody afterwards why I have opinions about this and why some of these things I don't like and some of them I do. But I chose Angular. I'm sticking to it because I really don't want to have to try any more. So this kind of feeds into, there's a word that crops up a lot in JavaScript, more than it does now. I mean, it's obviously a programming word, but or programmer's kind of part of the taxonomy. But it's the word awesome, and it's a word that kind of annoys me a bit because I was saving that for when the hand of God came down from the sky, you know, or the birth of my first child, or whatever. And the hyperbolic language gets to a point where apparently, you know, a JavaScript configuration file is awesome, and I don't know where to go linguistically from that. But it's particularly frustrating when you find yourself sort of middle of the night, your grunt config file isn't working, and you try and find some help. You go to Google and you do a search, and the first 20 links all start or have somewhere in them the word awesome, because everything in the world of JavaScript is awesome. So, yes, sorry, I've been affected by that. And it really is not awesome. It's lovely in places, but so you get this sort of, this is part of the youthful enthusiasm. This kind of emphasizes it. This is not an atypical thread. This thread actually occurred. It was a thread I was interested in because I did actually have this problem. So yeah, does anyone know how to set my grunt config file to ignore temporary files in the watch directory? This is important, by the way, especially if you use Emacs because it generates a lot of temporary files. And the answer was, have you tried using gulp? This was the first answer. There were a few down that sort of dealt with it, but this is generally the feeling. If your library doesn't work, you just move on to the next one that is better than the one before until the next one. But the goods, it's not all doom. Important to emphasize, you've got 100% installation base. There is an arms war among the engines. This is you know, you have had orders of magnitude improvement in JavaScript in the last few years. We're talking about thousands of times. That's incredible. That hasn't happened anywhere. It's now faster than Python by some considerable measure. And you normalize the syntax quirks. You get used to them. We'll go into the CoffeeScript thing very quickly in a minute. It's exhilarating. I mean, it's the flip side of the Wild West. It's exciting right now. And you have some increasingly powerful visualization tools which are written by proper programmers and are very solid, and which I can thoroughly recommend. They mean you can do amazing things on the browser, things that just wouldn't have been conceivable a few years ago. So it's worth sticking with. The D3 video has decided to disappear, doesn't matter. D3, I'm working with a Mac for the first time in millions of years. So. We'll go back to D3 and I'll just describe it rather than show you a little video, which didn't do a lot. D3 is what's called data-driven documents, and it's basically this humongous effort that used to be a library called ProtoVis, that where a guy called Mike Bostock has basically taken the absolute fundamental tenets of graph drawing, chart drawing, construction of visualizable data, and gone to task. And it was his PhD. I used ProtoVis maybe 5-6 years ago, and D3 has grown from that. And it's astonishingly powerful, flexible, adaptable. Huge learning, well, I say huge learning curve. There's a big learning curve, but unlike lots of software, it's actually worth going through it. Cross-filter, which you can generally use in conjunction with D3, is, which you might see here, just to show you that JavaScript has got sort of programming chops, so to speak. Is the battery maybe running out? Okay, this is, maybe the battery's running out. No, it isn't. Right, this is Cross-filter. Cross-filter was a library written by Mike Bostock and friends. The idea was essentially you got this huge data set of airline arrivals, departures from American airports, and the idea was to be able to search all of this in real time, filtering the data by various dimensions and searches. And as you can see, you're able to essentially manipulate hundreds of thousands of data points in real time, and that's all running using the JavaScript engine. So increasingly these days, the power requirements for complex visualizations are there. Server-side JavaScript, once again, just to emphasize, there's nothing to compare with the better Python libraries. Numpy and Scipy, absolutely nothing. Modularity, simple things like modularity, the ability to take modules and reuse them, code reuse has not been nailed down at all. And as I said, I think the glory of Python is the libraries. There are a few edge cases where stuff like Node.js would make a lot of sense to somebody. Massive asynchronous web traffic stuff. And I think in the way that if you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail, for a lot of people, they sort of run with that and have ignored a few gaping holes in the JavaScript ecosystem, certainly on the server. CopyScript you might hear about. It's sort of Python, Ruby-ish syntactic sugar. For various reasons, I tried it, didn't like it, probably because I knew JavaScript beforehand and it didn't offer me anything particularly new. The main take-home is it's the debugging it's a precompiled, there's a precompile phase, and this means that with debugging, you've got to have code mapping work in the browser, and it's just another thing to worry about personally. I certainly wouldn't suggest it for anyone who's starting with JavaScript, because you won't be able to understand the debug. So we've got a Python, we've got JSON. We need Python on the data munging, and we need JavaScript to visualize it. The glue is JSON. And JSON is JavaScript object notation, devised by Crockford. And this should make it a bit more clear. That's the sort of thing. And I think for any Pythonista, that looks pretty familiar, workable. You have objects, you have keyed objects, you have lists, a fairly conventional data form. And using that, you can communicate between your Python server backend and your browser front end. And converting between sort of from native Python objects to JSON is not too difficult at all. In fact, it's trivial. Of course, there's a JSON module, and as you can see, it's pretty easy to use. You load JSON in. You can do a load string, which means you load a JSON string, which you've hopefully correctly formatted, or you can just load a file object, and it will convert that into a a native Python data structure. So couldn't be more convenient, really. Server to client, this is the sort of issue you face with. These are the solutions to it. You're trying to get your JSON from your web server to your browser. You can send a static file, no flexibility. It's fast, but you can't dynamically change the data required. You can't do anything much. You've got an API call, which is probably how most of the web works. I would suggest RESTful. If you don't know what RESTful is, I'd advise looking it up. It certainly could save you a lot of headaches. I think RESTful APIs are worth the effort to get right. So basically here, the web browser will make a call back to the server and request data according to a kind of RESTful URL. The other option, which is getting used a lot more these days, is WebSockets. They're a bit esoteric even now, but there are some huge wins that you can get from using them, and particularly when you want to reuse existing engines on the back end. So if you've written something in Python, you already have a visualization library, say in Python, and you just want to swap out the Python visualization library and stick in a new spangly JavaScript version, then WebSockets is quite possibly a way to go. Right, lightweight servers, one-line solution. This is your development server. Couldn't be easier with Python. That's one line, and that will basically, if you're developing, you need to be running a server to negotiate your. Neil, this is your fault. I'm going to kill you afterwards. Sorry, I've said it now, so I can't. Can I? Damn. So that is your lightweight server, one-line solution, and the gotches are streaming video, ha ha ha, and WebSockets can be problematic. And in that case, you need something not exactly heavyweight, but that is a lot more flexible and powerful. Flask is my personal, I guess the idea is having tool sets or tool kits, so you have kind of a best of breed. I love Flask because it's very lightweight. Django is probably the one you've heard of. It's huge, it's great. If you want to build a full website, it's brilliant. If you want to build something where you've got this minimal amount of code to worry about and you want something really simple and pared down, Flask, which is built on Worksug, is fantastic. And there you have your basic Hello World Flask server, which can be turned into, this is a very rudimentary little, as you can see, RESTful API call. But as you can see, it's just a few lines. And then you have that running in root, and you can start playing around and doing some interesting things on your browser and making calls. Databases, people talk about Mongo because it's Bison-based, which is Bison sort of a form of JSON, binary JSON. I think, and it's also used in this Meteor framework, which essentially mirrors your Mongo database to the browser, which is lovely. But the Meteor framework is quirky. The point is Python makes working with JSON so easy it's not really a big issue, I think. And if you have problems with your JSON form, you can write a custom serializer, there's an example at the bottom, which will deal with things, data forms that are not JSONable easily. You can just, you can encode and decode them using a custom serializer, which you probably will have to do if you use anything more interesting than, if you use, for example, Python dates, date times, that kind of stuff. So this is just a use case where I have pre-existing Python code, simulation code, or an engine, anything that's, or even a data mining engine, anything you can imagine, where you have had to hack together a visualization front end at some point, a GUI. I think this is a very common scenario. You've got your GUI, it's sitting there, but it's on your desktop, and you want to share it with people, and you don't want to have them having to install stuff on their machine for all sorts of reasons. And so how can you make it as easy as possible to make the transfer? And I guess for my purposes nowadays, I'm trying to use a kind of iron rule, which is if it will ever conceivably need to be visually displayed for anybody, then it's got to be on the browser. And increasingly, there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case. There's very little you can't now do. And just in terms of the fact that you can distribute it to the world at the press of a button, that's just such a huge advantage. So this was a little simulation I wrote for the details aren't actually that important, but let's see. So the idea is, I mean, this was just, it doesn't matter what it is so much, but I had written a GUI, a Qt GUI for this, which had a little robot, and you can see its neural network there, and sort of, you can see its little nervous system, and you can go in and just play with it. And everything was there, except the front end was all Qtified, and therefore I couldn't show it to anyone. It didn't exist on a browser. And so the idea was just, I set myself the task of converting the bulk of it into, just a way to learn as much as anything else, into the web browser. So you can see this is WebGL, this is kind of 3D graphics, and it uses Bootstrap and Angular and some other stuff. And this is sort of, which I think is becoming very easy to do. You've got your native GUI, you've got your engine. If you've been at all sensible, you've separated everything out. You've got your modular decomposition. You can ask the engine, in my case a simulator, for a state, the state of the robot's, say, nervous system at any one time, the state where its position, the position of its limbs, all that kind of stuff. And before, they've all been fed into a conventional GUI. And now all you've got to do is interpose your Flask server to pack the data in a JSON form, just JSONify it, stick it out to your WebGL. I'd say WebGL, Angular, and Bootstrap is a pretty good place to be starting if you're going to be looking to build kind of web consoles. And now you have it on the web, and that means you can share it with the world, which for me is a huge take-home. You can also, obviously a lot of this is for development purposes, but what it means is that because you built it in, you baked it in, when and if that time comes for you to start sharing it, you're not going to have, as I have on millions of occasions, that threshold, that I'll get it done one of these days. You're not going to have that. You're in the zone, and that is a good thing. Visualizing the weather, this is another kind of, I should mention that all of the back end there was done using Python and Cython. So someone here uses Cython. So visualizing the weather, this is the old version. Possibly because I'm English, possibly because just the weather occurs. I wanted to play around with some visualization, and I wanted to do some visualization using maps. So the idea was to go to the Met Office and ask them for some data to see if they had any historical data. They're not that generous, has to be said. I think they want you to pay for most things these days. They have a page, this page, where you can go. This is it, pretty much. And they have the data that's been collected from 30 or 40 or 50 stations around the British Isles. Some of this started collecting data in 1838. I think it's the earliest one. Some of them stopped for like 30 years and then came back on again. You can probably imagine what the data files are like. The data files are interesting. If you click expectantly on one of these dots, hoping to see some kind of funky visualization that's going to show you the weather over time in that period, you see, whoa! It's exciting, isn't it? It's obviously not moving very fast, but I've slowed it down so you can read it. This data format was made up by somebody in 1865. No, it's not tab, it's tab separated, whatever. What they're called, the null markers change arbitrarily over time. They change arbitrarily over space. So different monitoring stations would just suddenly use an asterisk to signify a null point, and the others would use a hash key. We're talking about having to clean up the data first to turn it into anything, allowing for the fact that it's just horrible and filthy. Python makes this, if not a joy, it's just emphasizing the point. I can't imagine doing this in JavaScript or pretty much any other language. But in Python, it was more than feasible, using CSV and using some other libraries to clean it up. But this is dirty, dirty, dirty data. Thanks, Met Office, for making it so easy for me. So the idea was to turn that into something like this. So it's the idea that you can kind of click on different years, and you can see the we'd have some interesting blue on the middle graph over the last few months, I think. Fortunately, it's only up to 2010. I'll have to see. But yeah, we'd have an interesting signature now. And right, OK. Anyway, it was lovely and really cool. So how do you go about turning the one into the other and getting beautiful animated weather that you didn't see? Clean the data files, PyMongo, regex, glob, beautiful. No equivalent in JavaScript. Python's tailor-made for this kind of stuff. It makes it as easy as it's going to be. In order to communicate with D3 and get the graph information, you need to convert it to GeoJSON form. There is, of course, a GeoJSON library for Python, and I wasn't expecting it to be anything else. It's easy to sort of emphasize, it's easy to get blasé, but there's always a library in Python, right? Which is astonishing, really, for me. For example, there was one of the problems was converting these weird Met Office coordinates, which, as I said, started sometime in 1880, into something that a conventional mapping program could use. And somebody had written one. It's a module. And it's free to the world. It's out there on GitHub. And I'm very appreciative. I think this possibly sums up for me, or at least one of these lines sums up for me, the power of, I guess, Python, Scipy, various other things. You've got all these arbitrary data points on your map, and you want to produce an interpolated grid that is nice and uniform. And already it's kind of a bit of a head trip. I mean, I can kind of think about how I might go about it. But there is, of course, a Scipy interpolate module, and that module has interpolate 2D, and you just feed in pretty much your column of data, and out comes an interpolated grid, which you can then quiz for latitude and longitude to send your values to send through to D3. Once again, couldn't be done in JavaScript, or at least I'd have had to write a 400 or 500-line JavaScript library for myself. In conclusion, JavaScript is not just a necessary evil. The language has sort of crufty, gnarly bits, but it's not actually as bad as you've probably heard. It's also, you very quickly, as I mentioned, you normalize to the quirks. You just have to get used to doing certain things till they become rote. And as mentioned, a linter will really help you there. It's actually getting some first-class libraries. It's not just horrible sort of sub-jQuery. Well, not that jQuery is a horrible library, but be careful what I say. I'll be lynched by the JS boys. But there have been some kind of, yeah, there have been some libraries that have been pretty flaky in the past. Some of the stuff out there now is getting good. It's getting good because the web is everything, right? And it needs to be good. And some people care enough now. And the tool sets are getting better. It's basically the perfect complement to Python's data crunching. And I honestly think that separating the data crunching abilities of Python and just, I mean, I've used WXPython, I've used Qt, I've used them all, and I've enjoyed them. But at the same time, when it comes to sharing them with anyone, I'm lost. I mean, I just tend to put that to the back of the priority list, and it never happens. So yeah, we can offload most visualizations to the web, and this is only going to get better and easier. You've got OpenGL, you've got a lot of number crunching ability, and you've got D3, for example, which is really just first in class, I think. So that's it.
Obviously, Python's now looking towards having JavaScript widgets. I don't know if you're aware of that in the notebook.
I play with the notebook, which I like. There's Vega. You're not talking about Vega so much.
No, I think it's on the roadmap for like the next 6 to 12 months.
Right.
To have, like, basically
I ignore all roadmaps. It's got to be old in at least 6 months. Although in JavaScript, 6 days is mature. But I have to keep reminding. I always figure that with Python, it's like 10 wise men go up to the mountains before anything happens, and they converse for 6 years. And JavaScript just happens like that. So I guess in the Python ecosystem, I'm generally quite slow. But that sounds great. I mean, there is this thing called Vega, which I should have mentioned. I think I did on one slide. A broken slide, probably. There's this thing called Vega, which in theory will enable you to, well, not in theory, I've used it, so it works. You can actually construct D3 graphs using Python. It's cool. In my opinion, you lose pretty much everything that's great about D3, which is the interactivity. The other thing I should have stressed is, and the difference that was seen in that weather chart, we're talking about interactive data. We're talking about manipulating data. We're talking about drilling down. We're talking about playing with data, getting into the front visual cortex. The ability to do that is really important. And a lot of these widgets, I don't know about the Python ones, but a lot of them will probably end up being, kind of, if not static charts, they'll certainly have a lot of limited functionality.
No, I think that, so they're designing an API basically in the notebook, so you'll have two-way communication.
Okay. But that's, I guess that's within the notebook, sort of.
The dev version.
Yes.
So it's in 2 weeks.
Okay, cool. That sounds brilliant. But I guess it's a bit specialized. I mean, it's great for Pythonistas, but it's a bit. Sorry.
Yes, you just demonstrate some kind of interactive visualization with D3. Does it mean we actually loading all the data upfront to the client?
No, I should have mentioned which was kind of in the graph. But the thing about WebSockets is it creates a two-way interface, handshake, and it maintains that pipe. It's the basis. It's a trick that has been used by web gamers or web game designers. So basically, you can have a server that's generating data, and the client is just, there's a two-way line of communication. So the client can request. So technically, it's interactive. I mean, it's interactive with the server, and the latencies are pretty good. So you can, I mean, it's gaming, right? So the gaming boys are going to make sure that it all works optimally because they need low latencies. And I guess some of us will be the beneficiaries of that. But
yeah, how much overhead for internal developing does it?
Sorry?
I mean, how much overhead do we have to have this kind of interaction? Is it something out of the box or something like that?
You set up a WebSocket in, say, Flask server or any server, whatever server you're using. You set up a WebSocket, and then the client has to know to get how to create that handshake. So yeah, it's as hard as WebSockets, which are not as hard as they might be.
Compound one, if I may. On WebSockets, I wasn't aware that Flask did WebSockets easily out the box without much hand-rolling.
It has to use a sort of G.
I had quite a good time with Autobar. Now, have you tried that and compared the two?
I haven't. I was just looking for something easy and quick. It was using G-event, so I mean, this is a kind of Flask thing. Flask isn't technically a good asynchronous server sort of out of the box, and it has certain other quirks. Yeah, Flask works. You just download G-event and it did the job. But that's a kind of hacky. I did it for myself. If I wanted to distribute it to other people, then I think I'd be looking for something a bit more robust.
Also, with regards to properly graphy graphs, as in networks, would you still go with D3 or maybe Sigma? Have you tried doing that much?
I haven't used Sigma so much. I mean, I haven't seen very much stuff that where you got the feeling that JavaScript was just hitting a ceiling of functionality. I mean, I've programmed something recently in a job I've been doing where we were dealing with 150,000 data points, network, in fact, graph, and it was fine. In fact, you looked at the bottleneck, and it turned out drawing was the biggest bottleneck. It wasn't actually the maths. It wasn't the data crunching behind it. It was rendering it on the screen was often the problem, and that could be an issue with a lot of this stuff. But I don't feel that I feel that JavaScript's got the oomph. Sorry.
It was a pretty cool talk in the Packard Use meetup
Thank you.
back in September. As a chap, you talked about 3D visualization using CSS. I don't know whether...
Well, CSS is kind of, I guess it's not programming, it's kind of...
Yeah.
You can, with HTML5, you can do some stuff, but you can't, I don't think you can program in CSS.
I mean, is there anything on the CSS side that is limiting you, or...?
No, I mean, CSS is just a style sheet, so it's just the gloss. I mean, CSS in and of itself, obviously it's not a language, so it's just for prettifying stuff. My tip for CSS is I like Bootstrap, which is this, it's come out of, is it Twitter? Yeah, it's Twitter's kind of contribution, and it's...
So you don't go into the CSS, you just detect whatever you...
I use it. You have to if you're doing kind of web design, but it's not. I guess it's the gloss. It's the decoration. So, yes, you.
Let's say I want to build a web app that will draw some nice interactive charts. Is there a better starting point than just starting from getting Flask and then try to figure out JavaScript libraries? Other high-level frameworks, or maybe some nice projects on GitHub?
Possibly. I mean, one thing you could do is just, as mentioned, you could serve it as a static file, just for initial, just to get your head around it, you know. So, I mean, you're going to have a server somewhere if you're doing web development. So you can, if you just don't want to worry about the API calls, just serve a static file with the data in it. I mean, a lot of sites do that anyway. And if you do what's called freezing your site, it's all static. So eventually you end up with data files. I would say a data file with your data, we just play toy data is a really good way to get started. Unfortunately, I mean, D3, as mentioned, D3, which is certainly what I recommend, it does have a high learning curve. That's going to be your big learning. Everything else is pretty simple by comparison.
So how much JavaScript did you actually have to write to get that weather?
The weather, I can't show you. Let's see. The weather was maybe 200 lines, maybe 250, 300. I mean, that's the JavaScript. The Python, which if anyone ever sees that code, I will never get a job again. But the Python was hacky, especially hacking the data, and that ran into a few hundred lines, I guess. It's kind of dual.